Good evening and welcome to The World Today, being brought to you, as usual, from the Bolivar Hall in central London. Tonight, we're going to discuss the Vietnam War, probably one of the most significant events in the 20th century. And the reason for discussing it is pretty straightforward. Recently, PBS, the American television network, has run a film which is being shown all over Europe and no doubt in other parts of the world on the Vietnam War. Today we're going to review and discuss, from a critical point of view, the documentary on Vietnam, which was made over 10 years. It's 18 hours long and cost $30 million. Joining me for this discussion are Rod Stoneman, an old colleague, friend from Channel 4 days, the golden age of Channel 4 in the 1980s. Rod has subsequently, after working as a commissioning editor at Channel 4, moved on to the Irish Film Board and has been involved with all the new technologies of filmmaking in the digital era. With him is Professor Heonik Kwon, teaches anthropology at Cambridge. Heonik is from South Korea, one of the two countries that sent troops under heavy pressure from the United States who participated in the war and participated in atrocities. The other country was, of course, Australia. This is a film made by Ken Burns, principally, a person who also made a history of the American Civil War. In the first of two parts on this film, and of course the war, we're going to discuss the origins of the war, how the documentary shows it, etc. But first, a few comments on what this film represents and what it does not represent. It's often said that it's the victors who write history, not in the case of Vietnam, and not in the case of other wars where the United States has malfunctioned, to put it mildly. So this is a story of the Vietnam War as seen largely through the eyes of Americans. And this documentary starts disconcertingly with an untruth.
America's involvement in Vietnam began in secrecy. It ended 30 years later in failure, witnessed by the entire world.
And what did you see, my darling?
It was begun in good faith by decent people out of fateful misunderstandings, American overconfidence, and Cold War miscalculation.
Did you hear that?
It was begun in good faith by decent people out of fateful misunderstandings.
It's unfortunate, this opening, because actually it's contradicted by many elements in the film itself. The archive often contradicts the commentary. And the archive is sometimes not fully explained, not contextualized. Many things in this 18-hour documentary are missed out completely. And of course, you get very little footage and archive from the North Vietnamese themselves, who, after all, made numerous films and documentaries on the war. Much of this footage could have been used if the aim had been to provide a balanced documentary. This doesn't mean that everything in this documentary is false. That would be a mistake. There are, of course, many, many good interviews and good archive footage. But at the end of it, you're left feeling slightly uneasy as to what could have been, but what clearly isn't. Welcome both. Rod, if I could start with you, because I have a very clear memory in your days as commissioning editor in Channel 4, when you actually went to Vietnam, if my memory serves me right, and showed a set of films from the Vietnamese side on this channel many, many years ago. Could you describe that before we get onto this documentary?
Yes, I mean, there were some constraints and limitations on what was possible to do, even in early Channel 4, though I concur with you. It was an opening for a more pluralist, a more argumentative space on British television at that time. And in 1991, I went to Vietnam. I think saw about 45, 50 films, documentaries and fictions, and put together, selected a season of Vietnamese cinema. And Neil Gibson, who is no longer with us, but Neil Gibson made a really excellent documentary about the evolution of cinema in Vietnam. And the concept was, completely clear and consonant with what we were doing in other areas of Channel 4, which was to allow direct speech, to hear directly with, not without mediation, but with minimal mediation from other people. And the Vietnamese, of course, they don't even call it the Vietnam War. They call it the American War to separate it from the French War, the Japanese War, the Chinese War. And there was an extraordinary moment which indicates those limitations when Liz Forgan, who was the head of factual programming, called me to her office and said, what do you plan to do with this season of Vietnamese cinema? I said, we're ready to show it at the beginning of 91. And she said, the timing is not possible. America had just begun the first Iraq War, Bush the father taking America after the Kuwait episode into Iraq. And Liz's words, I remember to this day, is we cannot be showing Vietnamese films at a time when real American soldiers are dying in the deserts of Kuwait. And I said, well, you need to see these films because they're not anti-American.
Heonik, your own interest in Vietnam began when?
I'm an anthropologist. So it's, I long had an interest growing up in a very anti-communist South Korea. I long had an interest what in anthropology called the other. For me, the other was not Western civilization, or it was on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So my first field work was in Soviet Russia during the last year of Soviet Empire, if you like. And then I moved slowly into what I call post-colonial Cold War, coming in order to go closer to where I came from. So and then my work is mostly on locally based, in local history of Vietnam War, mainly in Quang Ai and Quang Nam province. I started with the history of atrocities in these two areas, involving a local practice of commemoration, reconciliation, etc. Yeah.
I suppose I should reveal my own connections with Vietnam. I was in North Vietnam, in Hanoi, in Da Nang, in southern provinces, during heavy bombing from December 66 to January 67. So I spent about 6 weeks in North Vietnam, seeing how they were coping with the war. And I have to say, I am a partisan. I was totally on the side of the North Vietnamese. And at one point, I asked the North Vietnamese Prime Minister, Pham Van Dong, could we not have international brigades, just as an act of solidarity, fighting with you? And he came up, walked up to me, gave me a hug, and said, wish we could agree to that. But this is not Spain. This is a highly technological war. And we would have to spend too much money making sure our foreign guests in the international brigades weren't killed, which would take resources away from the actual struggle, which was a very convincing argument. But the other things I witnessed, which of course are not in this documentary, is that in order to minimize the effect of carpet bombing, often the Vietnamese built individual shelters like manholes, which I witnessed during a bombing raid myself. And they said in single shelters, if a bomb hits us, several 100,000 people can die. Here, if there's a direct hit, it's sad, but at least only one person dies. This is what we do to try and limit casualties. And, you know, one observed firsthand, because we were sent there by Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre to bring back evidence for their war crimes tribunal.
The town was on fire incendiary bombs had been used. When we walked in, we had to walk, in most cases, over embers which had been lit. And we had to walk fast because our feet, while walking in these embers, were feeling hot. It had been impossible to visualize the agony of those under attack from a cozy office or from a cozy home in Western Europe. One was face to face with a situation which the Vietnamese told us has existed ever since the United States first started the bombing. They said, "Tell us, comrade, do you think what the United States is doing to us today, do you think the use of napalm, of phosphorus, of fragmentation bombs, of all the other insidious devices they have invented, do you think that the United States would use them in Europe today?" And it was extremely difficult to reply in the affirmative.
Every single day, children being killed, babies being maimed by bombs dropping, churches being bombed, hospitals being bombed. That feeling we don't get from this documentary. Rod.
I think one of the decisions that clearly they made at the beginning of the documentary was to thread it with interviews, oral history individual interviews, which of course are overwhelmingly American. There are a few Vietnamese in it, but almost entirely American. And though, of course, oral history in talking about Vietnam, as in other areas, gives us some insight into people's experience, it rarely provides sharp or analytical understanding. I mean, frankly, now as when I worked in Channel 4, I don't want documentaries entirely people with books behind their heads talking intellectually, but you do need a mixture of discourses to go beneath the surface of the visceral experience, especially a dramatic and awful visceral experience of being in a war. And although I think I would like to say it's good, given the state of current television, that a serious set of programs has been made, and the aesthetics is stronger than the 1983 WGBH previous, it was called Vietnam and Television History, previous set of programs. Music's used really well, and the aesthetics are stronger.
Ladies and gentlemen, Santana!
The problem is that they do not provide a set of programs which really offer insight, and I think America continues to be in danger of repeating its mistakes by not understanding itself.
Heonik, what was your first impression of these films?
I would totally agree with Rod that it's aesthetically really superior to many things I've seen in previous occasions. And also I would say that it made an effort to bring, if you like, the Vietnamese perspective into the story to a certain extent. And among my historian colleagues, that has been one of the main tellers of historical scholarship of Vietnam War for the past, let's say, 10 to 15 years. How to strike a balance between the outside and inside, the Vietnamese and American perspective into it. And I think it followed that trend to a certain extent, but honestly, I think the producers could have benefited a lot had they spoken to some of these historians involved in this trend and making this trend. And on the question of aerial bombing, several friends have been working on the history of aerial bombing. That doesn't start with the Vietnam War, but much earlier. And it's, we talk about North Korea, a problem involving North Korea, but it's the devastation of North Korean society by aerial bombing.
Every single building in North Korea
just,
was destroyed.
yes, it's not forgotten. It's
every
not,
single.
So,
if we discuss now how they depicted the French presence in Vietnam, that was depicted in the documentaries much more critically, if you notice, than the American presence itself. The French were depicted as being racists, about treating the Vietnamese as semi-slaves, as being arrogant, as thinking that they had a right to rule this colony forever. They even brought in footage showing Douglas Gracie, the British general who went in with the Indian troops to take Saigon back from the Viet Minh and hand it to the French as part of the European colonialist machinations, which is of course all true. And I was very pleased with all that, because it's not often shown, and then how the French use napalm.
By 1953, the French had been fighting for 7 years. They had suffered over 100,000 casualties and failed to pacify the countryside. 6 commanders had come and gone. Nevertheless, the 7th commander, General Henri Navarre, assured his countrymen that victory was near. Now we can see it clearly, he said, like the light at the end of the tunnel. Meanwhile, large parts of the French population were horrified by reports of French brutality and the widespread use of napalm, gelatinized petroleum that burned foliage, homes, and human flesh.
What they didn't show was that at the height of the siege of Dien Bien Phu, this famous victory that the Vietnamese won, which will mark the end of French rule, at the time of the siege, an offer from the United States Secretary of State, I think it was John Foster Dulles, if memory serves me right, offering the French tactical nuclear weapons to get rid of these yellow ants crawling up your hills. Now, it would have made a very interesting contrast and shown that what happened was a continuation of colonial wars, that when the European colonies, colonial powers got exhausted, tired, and were defeated in one way or the other, like the British in the Middle East and India, the French in Algeria, the Dutch in Indonesia, the power that took over all the colonial responsibilities without direct rule was, of course, the United States of America. That is a pattern that has taken place and is still taking place as we speak, discussing the last century's wars. But that note about the French could easily have been transferred and imported. I mean, I recall when the torture stories came out from Abu Ghraib in Iraq of these awful photographs that Marines had sent, including women soldiers, by the way, sent a lot of these of them sexually using male prisoners. I was in Chicago at a literature festival, and people were talking about Abu Ghraib as if it was something new. And a former American Marine stood up and said, I don't know what world you guys live in on the platform. We've done all this stuff 100 times worse in Vietnam. And he described how 2 prisoners, Vietnamese Liberation Army prisoners they'd captured, and he said, we captured them and we said to them, talk. They wouldn't talk. We then disemboweled one of these prisoners and told the other one, this is what happens if you don't talk. You seen what we've done? I mean, there was pin drop silence in the hall, because of course most of the people didn't know. And after seeing this documentary, though you learn many useful things, the extent of torture and the way in which the Vietnamese were dehumanized is something you don't see.
Yeah, when I watched that first 2 episodes dealing with the transition from the French to American occupation, and the 2 things came to my mind, and we know enough now that, for instance, in 1945, the U.S. merchant marine ships, they were at the end of the Pacific War, and they were overjoyed, and they were committed to their work, assigned work to bring back the boys from the Pacific War theater back home, and then they were ordered to cross the Pacific Ocean and go to the Mediterranean Sea and to ship the French soldiers back to Vietnam. And then my late colleague Marilyn Young starts her book, magnum opus, the Vietnam Wars in plural, with that single episode. So Marilyn speaks about this incident of mutiny among certain merchant marines who oppose this order. So that's exposition of human conscience, of American democratic spirit, if you like, whichever way you approach it. So I think there are different ways to approach it, but I think it's now we have to start with the fact that the post-1945 exercise of American power was very close to that of imperial power in many parts of the world, and let's accept it and find a way in which Americans resisted that repetition of imperial formation in post-World War II eras. And I think there are numerous historical episodes through which we can find a different way of approaching, coming to terms with these tragic events such as Vietnam War.
The other side of it, of course, is this, that in countries which the United States really bombed to smithereens, let's say Cambodia, for instance, that the bombing of Cambodia, totally unnecessary, which prolonged the war for no rhyme or reason. Everyone knew that in the United States, but they carried out the bombing of Cambodia. The scale of that bombing was so huge that in response to what was left of the country after the bombing, they produced local monsters like Pol Pot. You cannot explain the Pol Pot phenomenon without understanding what had happened to Cambodia. So people tend to isolate him, which is wrong. And similarly, Heonik, I would argue that the fact that they destroyed every single dwelling, every single building in North Korea during the Korean War of 1950 to 53 had some part in producing a sort of absurdist dynasty of the Kim Il-sungs. Sure. The two are basically linked. But
it's impossible they are unrelated.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. But it's what Rod called the lack of analysis. And the thing is, if you read some episodes between the lines, then it becomes very clear what's going on. That is not the aim of the documentary, but some of this stuff comes through in what Kennedy is saying, in what Lyndon Johnson is saying, in what Truman actually says at one point that we're fighting this war which is crucial for our national security.
Truman continued to increase military aid for the French war in Vietnam.
If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere. We are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival.
I mean, the world's largest power threatened by a small Asian country. I mean, that's not true. And then they say that it's all a Russian conspiracy, when we know for a fact that the Russians were reluctant, both in the case of the Korean War. They were not present in the UN Security Council when the vote was taken to send a UN mission to fight that war. And they were very careful and cautious in Vietnam as well. The big obsession in the case of both Korea and Vietnam was China. This revolution that had just been successful, would it spread eastwards? Not understanding that, particularly in the case of Vietnam, there were strong differences with the Chinese, you know, some agreements as well. So it's a lot is left to the imagination, which people will have to fill in. But
can I just say one thing which isn't left to the imagination is that in listening to the tape-recorded private conversations of American presidents played in the series, between Lyndon Johnson and McNamara, between Nixon and Kissinger, I was shocked to hear the same kind of aggressive vernacular that we recognize in the public discourse of the current president of the United States. That our images of previous presidents are somewhat different because we didn't listen to their telephone calls at the time.
Dr. Kissinger?
Yeah, Mr. President. Yeah, hi, Henry. This was the best speech you've delivered since you've been in office.
Yeah. I'll say one thing. This little speech was a work of art. I mean, I know a little something about speech writing, and it was no act because no actor could do it. No actor in Hollywood could have done that well. I thought that was done well, didn't you think?
First of all, no actor could have written it. To begin with, you couldn't have done it unless you had meant it.
Yeah. Yeah. And if it doesn't work, I don't care. I mean, right now, if it doesn't work, then let me say, though, I'm going to find out soon, and then I'm going to turn right so goddamn hard it'll make your head swim. We'll bomb those bastards right off the earth. I really mean it.
But actually what historical documentaries like these bring out is actually there is a continuity there, which is more upfront in the stance that the current president wants to say. And I think one good thing about this series is even if they don't like to use the word defeat, they prefer to use the word failure in this documentary series. Even failure is a good point because very recently Trump in Tokyo said, and talking about North Korea, of course, Trump a few weeks ago said, American forces always win.
I know.
Well, of course, Vietnam is the one clear example to the contrary.
Exactly, and not only was it a failure, it was an absolutely stunning political military defeat. The first time in history that the American empire had suffered a defeat of this proportion. And so they were in such a state of shock. Of course, the more naive of the anti-war side said, this is it. This means the Americans are finished forever. They will never be able to fight a war again, etc., which was never credible. They had to, we all wish, but it was never credible. But that's what you see you don't get from the films, the scale of that defeat, which had a huge impact in the world. I mean, I wonder whether, had the Americans won that war and crushed the North, whether the Cubans would have had the courage and the guts to send Cuban soldiers to Angola to help defeat the South African apartheid armies there. Who knows? You know, these things had a big impact internationally. And the liberation forces in Africa, in Guinea, Mozambique, etc., said that they used to be listening to reports of victories in Vietnam by the Vietnamese, which gave them the courage to fight against Portuguese colonialism. So it was a global event on a scale that we can't perceive.